Hi, my name is Levi Thompson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin, and this is Middle Eastern Modernist Poetry Office Hours. Good question. Most scholars, when they try to address this, they have to disentangle these terms from each other. Modern, modernism, modernization, modernist, all of these different things have different valences. What I have decided to go with for the most part is that modern itself, or being modern, or thinking someone is modern, or oneself is modern, is a stance that somebody takes. And when a person, say a poet, decides to express this feeling through art or poetry or prose or whatever sort of creative medium, that is modernist. So how do we understand modernism as this artistic movement that supposedly develops in the 19th century and it lasts through the mid-20th century? It's approaching one's own cultural history from the pre-modern period and playing with it in a new way to create something new out of it. So there is an idea of newness here. No in Persian, jadid, to be jadid in Arabic. And these are the terms that the poets themselves, who didn't really call themselves modernists until much, much later, they were calling themselves new. And the poetry that they were writing is new poetry. Key themes of Middle Eastern modernism are very much in parallel to what we find in European modernism. If anyone is familiar with modernism in the audience, they might know T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland, English modernist poem, probably the most famous modernist poem that exists across the globe. The thing that's interesting about The Wasteland is when you start to dig a little bit past what you find in the first few lines, you find a Middle Eastern root to that poem, and that is the Tammuz myth. Tammuz, now we're into something that's distinctly Middle Eastern. It goes back to ancient times in Mesopotamia. The Tammuz myth is about a god who dies and is reborn each year with the harvest. T.S. Eliot uses this theme in The Wasteland, which is overall about the process of death and rebirth. I think he's quite pessimistic about the possibilities of rebirth, so there's an element of pessimism that I think is a defining feature of modernism as well. You go to the Middle Eastern modernists, they are also talking about wastelands, and not necessarily because they read T.S. Eliot, right? So they're engaging these themes of death and rebirth on the one hand, and they are doing so in order to confront the reality with which they're presented in the late 1800s up through, in my work, I stop right around 1970. The timeline is a little bit different than what we find in European modernism, but the themes are very much the same, and the formal experiments that these poets undertake are also quite similar, breaking apart old forms and putting them together in interesting ways. So I'm glad you started with Nima, because he is my starting point in the book I wrote about all this. And to answer your question simply, Nima Yushij did not read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland before he started writing what came to be known as Shirenu, new poetry in Persian, modernist poetry, Nimai, Nimaic poetry in Persian. No T.S. Eliot. Why? Because Nima Yushij didn't really speak English. I don't think he spoke much English at all. He did read French. So he read Charles Baudelaire. Who else read Charles Baudelaire? Eliot. Eliot read Baudelaire as well, right? There's an epigraph in the poem that's a line from Baudelaire. So Nima Yushij and Eliot are reading the same guy. Why is Baudelaire so interesting? He's the guy that coins the term modernism. What this tells us is Europe doesn't have a lock on the origins of modernism necessarily. Niemois engaged with Baudelaire and came to his own modernist project that is very much in parallel with T.S. Eliot's, but he never engaged with Eliot. Now, to broaden this a little bit, this isn't always the case. Of course, European literature in French and English especially is very influential across the entire globe. So later modernists, including other Iranian modernists after Niemois, and Niemois himself later in his career, did read Western modernist poetry. Journals in English and French circulated across the globe. Why? Because of the colonial relationship. So of course that's there. The whole point of my project, though, has been to look at more local roots and formal foundations for modernist projects in Arabic and Persian. And I think that this approach can apply to other related contexts. I just don't work with these languages because it can be hard to learn an entire new language, and I haven't had time to learn Turkish or Kurdish or Armenian or let's say even Hebrew or Urdu or other related contexts. The answer is it had an extremely influential role. I've already mentioned the growth of nationalism and national ideas. Poets often wanted to write new poetry that matched these new ideals that emerged in the aftermath of this nationalist moment. Frequently we find the modernist poets positioning themselves in a decolonial mode, anti-colonial mode, trying to resist European colonial projects. And then in the aftermath of the independence movements, revolutions, things like that throughout the first half and into the second half of the 20th century, we then see nationalist ideas playing out here as well. But the interesting thing, I think, with the modernists is for the most part, they are, like T.S. Eliot, highly pessimistic about the possibilities of what will come after nationalism. For instance, you see a lot of malaise and despair enter into these poetic contexts after the failure of populist movements, let's say, just to simplify them. They're not all necessarily communist, but populist. Iran, 1953, you have this coup d'etat against Mohammad Mossadegh, a popularly elected prime minister who nationalizes the Iranian oil industry. But there's a counter-revolutionary movement that succeeds, led by supporters of the Shah. And in the aftermath of this, the modernist poets, many of whom were communists or affiliated with the left, fall into this deep moment of introspection. And the poetry becomes not necessarily less political, but less explicitly political, more complicated. And it's more difficult to relate it directly to, say, more nationalist poetry that we would find from an earlier period. Find the same thing in Iraq with a poet like Badr Shakr Sayyab. Starts out as a communist. He's writing his first modernist poetry, which happens to be one of the first instances of truly modernist poetry in Arabic from 1947. He's a communist during this period, so it's related to his politics because it's liberatory in some way, right? We have a monarchy in power that's backed by the British in Iraq. But over time, Sayyab becomes disillusioned with communism and leftist movements in general. Why? Because he spent some time in Iran, and he was actually there when the coup happens in 1953. And he sees the Tudeh party, the party of the masses, that is the Iranian Communist Party, not respond to the coup against Mossadegh. And he throws up his hands and says, I'm done with communism, and he becomes a proto-Ba'athist. And the audience might be familiar with the word Ba'ath because that's the political party that Saddam Hussein comes from. So we have someone who was a major supporter of these progressive, liberatory, communist, leftist positions. We see that in his poetry in many ways, who then changes into an Iraqi nationalist who is also a pan-Arabist in some ways as well. There's another big term for us. Pan-Arabism is the idea that the Arabs are one nation, so it's trying to create a broader nation that's not just defined by, say, being Iraqi or Egyptian or Syrian. And in fact, around the same time, there was a movement to unite all these countries in the United Arab Republic. It didn't last very long at all. These things are all really interesting to me because the political and social and economic context plays into the poetry quite a bit, and the poetry is reacting to it. But at a certain point, we can no longer say that there are these direct relationships because the political malaise and the fact of failure leads to a more introspective type of modernism. Yeah, modernism and the past. The idea is that everything's new with modernism, right? Ezra Pound says, make it new. That's his directive to the European modernists. But then you go to T.S. Eliot and his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, and he says, in order to be a truly modern poet, you have to know your entire heritage all the way from Homer until today. The Middle Eastern modernists have the exact same approach. Why? Possibly because it's a little bit elitist. These poets went to school, they were educated in the Arabic tradition, some of them in folk ways, so they heard poetry from famous poets at home. This is very normal in Arab and Iranian culture as well. Arabs on the street even today will recognize a line from Mutanabbi, a 10th century poet. If you recited one, they'd say, that's Mutanabbi. So this is part of the culture. It's very vibrant poetry. But the Middle Eastern modernists, for the most part, were highly educated. They came from sometimes lower and middle class families, though. This is a new sort of feature of Middle Eastern society at the time because of the growth of secondary education, primary education, schooling. This is also a result of colonial involvement. So it's the British that set up a lot of the schools that these poets studied at in, say, Baghdad. You have missionary schools that are operating, teaching in French in Iran. Nima Yushish went to one of these. So these poets are becoming familiar not just with European literature, but they have the entirety of their cultural heritage behind them, and they're expected to know it very well. So when they go out to write this new poetry, that influence is very, very clearly there because they are so well grounded in the tradition that brings them to that moment. And we find the same thing with the European modernists, despite what Pound says, make it new. If you go into the wasteland, I'm using this as my reference point again and again. If you go into the wasteland, you're going to find references to the Bible, the Divine Comedy. You're going to find references to popular music that was coming out in the 19-teens. You're going to find references to, of course, Shakespeare. Guess what happens when you go to the Middle Eastern modernists? You find the same mixture, because they're familiar with all these things due to the colonial involvement in their countries, and you're going to find references to Iranian folklore, Arab folklore, short story traditions, obviously the Quran, Islamically inspired things, Islamic mysticism, that is Sufism, so Sufi poetry, which dates back more than 1,000 years as well. One major figure who shows up all across the Middle Eastern modernists, and I would suggest probably into northern India as well, although this is beyond the range of my expertise, is this guy named Hallaj. He's a Sufi mystic who's executed by the Abbasid Caliph in 922 CE. First modernist poem, or a poem that we could say has some modernist themes to it. It's called Afsaneh, legend or myth. It comes out in 1922. So there's a 1,000-year anniversary of the death of this major Sufi figure who is a real outsider. He declares Ana al-Haq in a public space. Ana al-Haq means in Arabic, I am the truth. Al-Haq, the truth, is a name of God. So this is kind of like declaring oneself to be divine. Why does he do so? Because this is the Sufi idea. You want to become one with the divine. But the public declaration of this is an issue. That's not good. So he's executed, right? His memory, though, is born again with the Middle Eastern modernist poets who engaged this story. Why? Because Al-Hallaj, in a 20th century reading, is a real social justice figure. He said things before he was executed, like, hey, instead of going on Hajj all the way from Baghdad to Mecca, what you ought to do is just build a Kaaba in your house and walk around it and save all that money and give it to poor folks who need food and clothes. Guess what? That sounds really good to communists, right? So in the 20th century, we see Middle Eastern modernist poets, including Niman Yushish, who uses a lot of these Sufi references in his poetry, and specifically an explicit reference to Hallaj from Adunis, who's one of these Beiruti modernists, who is positioning himself as sort of an inheritor of the Arabic tradition, but one who is wholly influenced by his engagement with French surrealism and modernism and the French tradition. He uses Hallaj a lot. So the cultural heritage is there. Abd al-Wahhab al-Bayati, Badr Shakr Sayyab's compatriot in Iraq, writes an entire poetic series about Hallaj and his execution. He's using this idea of Ana al-Haq and the revelation of the secret in the 20th century toward his own political ends by refiguring Hallaj as a 20th century revolutionary or something like that. Poets, for the most part, are calling the poems that they're writing that are modernist or new qasidas. A qasida is an ode. Now, the ode, the qasida tradition in Arabic goes back to the pre-Islamic period, an oral tradition that was then written down later. So the provenance is a little bit difficult to work with, but we're going back at least to the 6th century, maybe even earlier. The ode was a mono-rhymed, single-metered poem that goes from anywhere between 50 and 200 lines. So imagine that, writing a poem of 200 lines with the same rhyme at the end and repeating a rhyme word. It's a poetic defect. So you need 200 words. That's the standard from which all other Arabic poetry derives. After the Arabs, the Islamic conquests take over Iran. It's the same case with Persian. Persian also sets the qasida, ode, as the standard. And then other forms are derived from it later on, like the ghazal, love poem, the qita, this is an Arabic term, but the fragment, couple of lines of poetry. There are some folk forms that persist and maybe have roots that go outside of Arabic, but it's the qasida that stands at the center of all of this. And the modernist poets recognize this, and they call what they are writing qasa'id, but they are not sticking to the monorhyme, and they are changing up how the feet of the meters work. So they do stick to a single meter still. In most cases, there are some instances where they don't, but this is highly experimental. But the lines are not the same length. So if you look at an old qasida, it looks like this. It's got two hemisticks. Hemistick means half of a line. There's two. In the first line, you have a rhyme and a rhyme. And then all the rest of the poem, the lines are the same length with the rhyme at the end. A modernist poem is going to look like this. maybe a short one again, maybe a long one. Maybe there's a rhyme here, and then an internal rhyme, A, but it's not the end of the line, and then here is a B, C, D, D, back to A. Maybe it repeats, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's like a sonnet, maybe it doesn't. There's a lot more opportunity to move things around. This is why they call it sher hor in Arabic, free verse, which in the Persian case, they call either sher nimai, Nemaic poetry, after Nima Yushish, who started doing this, and is the most famous person for writing like this in the earliest period, or simply sher no, new poetry. And what's new about it? It doesn't look like the old qasida. I wouldn't suggest modernist poetry at the outset because it's very dark for the most part. However, even though the poem is, in my reading of it, quite dark, you might use the Rain Song by Badr Shakr Sayyab because it opens with something that seems a lot like what they called in the old qasida tradition the nasib, which is an amatory prelude. What is an amatory prelude? It's a little opening about a lover, okay? In the old qasida, the poet would stop at an abandoned campsite where there are traces of a fire, camel dung, maybe some bone scraps and some footsteps in the sand going off into the desert, and he would lament the departure of the beloved. Sayyab takes this idea and he puts it into his Middle Eastern modernist poem, The Rain Song, and the opening of that goes, and I'm going to have to translate it on the fly after I give you the Arabic. He says, عيناكِ غابتان خيل ساعة سحر أو شرفتان راح ينأى عنهما القمر. Your eyes are like two palm groves at the dawn hour, or they are like two upstairs patios from which the moonlight is slowly receding. Now, the images might not be clear here, but think about the two dark forests. It's the dark eyes. This is the most beautiful thing. They call it Ayn al-Hur in Arabic. The very dark eyes, they look like a doe's eyes, a deer, right? And the pupils will be extremely dark, right? So it's like two dark jungles. And why would they be jungles? Because the palm fronds are the lashes, right? That's the idea. The upstairs patios, they're like verandas, something like that. On a mashrabiyah, which is a traditional sort of window on an Arab house that we do find in Iraq, you have this highly decorative woodwork around a patio that sort of sets, it's like a gable or something like that, that goes out of the house a little bit. So it's like your eyes, and again, the shingles on the roof or the woodwork around will be like the eyelashes. So this is pretty beautiful, right? The rest of the poem, though, goes into lament for the poetic persona's dead mother, who he hopes will be reborn someday. So not great, probably not going to convince someone to fall in love with you, but if your recitation's good enough, maybe. Rather, I would say just go to the modern romantic poets like Nizar Qabbani, who use modernist forms, but this love poetry, I wouldn't call it modernist technically, even though it looks very similar. The lengths of the lines are going to be different and things like that. So I'd suggest go find a Qabbani translation and use that instead. The answer is yes, but it's not modernist, okay? There's a tradition called the Zajal that goes back to at least Andalusia. It was a poetic form that combined languages, so you had Arabic influence, you had Hebrew, you had some Spanish, because it's a mix of cultures prior to the Reconquista. But the form itself is called Zajal. The way it works is one poet will recite a line, a hijab, a lampoon, like National Lampoon, making fun of something, a satire, right, of another poet, and they're in a poetic competition, kind of like a slam poetry thing. He'll recite the line, and this next poet will have to take the final word of his poem, the first poet's poem, start his poem with that, and rhyme the end word with the rhyme that the first poet ends with. And in some cases, he might also have to use the exact same meter that the first poet used. And they're doing this extemporaneously. It's not prepared. So the second poet has no idea what the first poet will say. And lots of people will go and watch this happen. So you can imagine it's a lot like B. Rabbit in 8 Mile, if you've seen 8 Mile, at the end, where it's all about your wit and speed and your knowledge of the language. Jonah Hill in 22 Jump Street, maybe we could put him alongside some of these Middle Eastern modernist poets. I think better, though, would be if he engaged in some lyric sort of trickery or wittiness that matched what they do with the rhyme and the meter in the Zajel tradition, which, if I recall correctly, he does not really do in that scene. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. This has been Modernist Poetry in the Middle East Office Hours with Levi Thompson. Bye.